Hello and welcome to quiz time. It's time to take a delightful trip down memory lane and put your knowledge to the test. We have 90 fun-filled questions today, from classic movies and golden oldies to historical moments. So let's get ready. Which 1960s TV series featured a family of monsters living at 1313 Mockingbird Lane? The Addams Family, Dark Shadows, or the Munsters? The Munsters. What was the name of the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier commissioned in 1961? Nimitz, Kitty Hawk, or Enterprise? Enterprise. Which architect designed the distinctive TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport in 1962? Eero Saarinen, Louis Kahn, or Philip Johnson? Eero Saarinen. What was the original name of the band that would later become the Grateful Dead? The Warlocks, the Electric Prunes, or the Charlatans? The Warlocks. Which early computer programming language developed in 1959 was named after a 19th century mathematician? Fortran, COBOL, or Ada? Ada. What was the name of the first communications satellite launched in 1962? Telstar, Echo, or Simcom? Telstar. Which television journalist hosted the documentary series See It Now in the 1950s? Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow, or Chet Huntley? Edward R. Murrow. What was the name of the company that manufactured the Peanuts comic strip character Snoopy's favorite root beer? A&W, Hires, or Dads? Hires. Which pioneering female scientist published Silent Spring in 1962? Jane Goodall, Rachel Carson, or Barbara McClintock? Rachel Carson. What was the first popular music album to contain a booklet with printed lyrics? Highway 61 Revisited, Pet Sounds, or In the Wee Small Hours? In the Wee Small Hours. Which Soviet leader famously banged his shoe on a desk at the United Nations in 1960? Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, or Mikhail Gorbachev? Nikita Khrushchev. What was the name of the first successful cardiac pacemaker implanted in a human in 1958? Cardiac Greatbatch, Zoll Medical, or Electrodyne? Cardiac Greatbatch. Which innovative jazz musician pioneered the cool jazz movement with the album Birth of the Cool? John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, or Miles Davis? Miles Davis. What was the first commercially successful light beer introduced in 1967? Miller Lite, Bud Light, or Gablingers? Gablingers. Which Broadway musical is based on George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion? Camelot, Gigi, or My Fair Lady? My Fair Lady. What was the name of the first commercially successful photocopier introduced by Xerox in 1959? Xerox 914, 813, or 1000? Xerox 914. Which 1960s science fiction film was directed by Stanley Kubrick and featured a sentient computer named Hal? Planet of the Apes, Fantastic Voyage, or 2001: A Space Odyssey? 2001: A Space Odyssey. What was the first commercially successful portable electronic calculator introduced in 1967? Texas Instruments, Bomar, or Busicom? Busicom 141PF. Which pioneering rock and roll musician recorded Johnny B. Good in 1958? Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, or Chuck Berry? Chuck Berry. What was the name of the first mass-produced birth control pill approved by the FDA in 1960? Inovid, Orthonovum, or Overall? Inovid. Which experimental aircraft set a world speed record of 4,500 miles per hour in 1967? Bell X-1, X-15, or MiG-25 Foxbat? X-15. What was the name of the famous restaurant in New York City where the power lunch concept originated in the 1960s? Delmonico's, the Four Seasons, or Le Cercle? The Four Seasons. Which influential filmmaker directed Breathless in 1960, helping to launch the French New Wave movement? Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, or Claude Chabrol? Jean-Luc Godard. What was the first commercially successful food processor introduced in 1963? Cuisinart, Robot Coupe, or Moulinex? Robot Coupe. Which politician delivered the famous Checkers speech in 1952? Dwight Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson, or Richard Nixon? Richard Nixon. What was the name of the first successful artificial kidney machine developed in the 1940s? Clough Brigham kidney, Gambro dialyzer, or all-wall filter? Clough Brigham kidney. Which influential abstract expressionist painter was known for his drip painting technique? Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, or Jackson Pollock? Jackson Pollock. What was the name of the first commercially successful word processor introduced in 1964? WordStar, IBM MTST, or Wang 1200? IBM MTST. Which groundbreaking feminist book by Betty Friedan was published in 1963? The Second Sex, The Feminine Mystique, or The Female Eunuch? The Feminine Mystique. What was the first commercially successful transistorized hearing aid introduced in 1952? Sonotone, 1010, or Zenith Royalty, or Mako Element, excuse me. Sonotone, 1010. Which film director was known for the Hitchcock cameo where he would briefly appear in most of his films? Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick, or Alfred Hitchcock? Alfred Hitchcock. What was the first commercially successful home video game console released in 1972? Atari Pong, Magnavox Odyssey, or Fairchild Channel F? Magnavox Odyssey. Which pioneering female aviator was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932? Jacqueline Cochran, Bessie Coleman, or Amelia Earhart? Amelia Earhart. What was the name of the first successful monoclonal antibody developed in 1975? Rituximab, Muromonab CD3, or Infliximab? Muromonab CD3. Which artist created the famous Campbell's Soup Can series in 1962? Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Rauschenberg, or Andy Warhol? Andy Warhol. What was the first commercially successful oral anti-diabetic drug introduced in 1957? Metformin, tolbutamide, or glipizide? Tolbutamide. Which influential jazz pianist and composer wrote Take 5 in 1959? Thelonious Monk, Dave Brubeck, or Paul Desmond? Dave Brubeck. What was the first commercially successful color instant film introduced by Polaroid in 1963? Polacolor, SX70, or Kodachrome? Polacolor. Which pioneering computer scientist coined the term debugging when she removed a moth from a computer in 1947? Ada Lovelace, Grace Hopper, or Jean Jennings Bartik? Grace Hopper. What was the first commercially successful personal computer introduced in 1975? Apple I, Altair 8800, or Commodore PET? Altair 8800. Which actor starred as secret agent James Bond in the 1962 film Dr. No? Roger Moore, David Niven, or Sean Connery? Sean Connery. What was the first electric toothbrush for home use introduced in 1961? Oral-B, Interplaque, or Broxident? Broxident. Which influential Broadway choreographer created the distinctive dance styles for West Side Story and The King and I? Bob Fosse, Jerome Robbins, or Agnes de Mille? Jerome Robbins. What was the first commercially successful portable hairdryer for home use introduced in 1951? Conair, Revlon, or Racine Universal? Racine Universal. Which influential architect designed the glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut in 1949? Philip Johnson, Frank Lloyd Wright, or Ludwig Mies van der Rohe? Philip Johnson. What was the first commercially successful non-stick cookware coating introduced in 1956? Teflon, Tefal, or Thermalon? Teflon. Which actor played the role of Atticus Finch in the 1962 film adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird? Gregory Peck, James Stewart, or Henry Fonda? Gregory Peck. What was the first artificial satellite to transmit television signals launched in 1962? Echo, Syncom, or Telstar? Telstar. Which influential music producer was known as the Wall of Sound and worked with groups like the Ronettes and the Crystals? George Martin, Quincy Jones, or Phil Spector? Phil Spector. What was the first commercially successful contact lens introduced in 1949? PMMA lenses, hydrogel lenses, or silicone hydrogel lenses? PMMA lenses. Which pioneering female journalist became the first woman to anchor a network evening news broadcast in 1976? Connie Chung, Jessica Savage, or Barbara Walters? Barbara Walters. What was the first commercially successful automatic coffee maker for home use, introduced in 1952? Mr. Coffee, Chemex, or Wigomat? Wigomat. Which pioneering rock musician was known as The Killer and recorded Great Balls of Fire in 1957? Little Richard, Buddy Holly, or Jerry Lee Lewis? Jerry Lee Lewis. What was the name of the first commercially successful video cassette format introduced by Sony in 1971? VHS, U-matic, or Video 2000? U-matic. Which influential fashion designer introduced the new look in 1947, featuring nipped-in waists and full skirts? Balenciaga, Christian Dior, or Elsa Schiaparelli? Christian Dior. What was the first commercially successful transistor radio introduced in 1954? Regency TR1, Sony TR55, or Emerson 888? Regency TR1. Which influential jazz saxophonist was known as Bird and was a pioneer of bebop? John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, or Sonny Rollins? Charlie Parker. What was the first commercially successful credit card introduced in 1950? Visa, MasterCard, or Diners Club? Diners Club. Which influential author wrote On the Road, published in 1957? Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, or Jack Kerouac? Jack Kerouac. What was the first commercially successful microwave oven for home use, introduced in 1967? Amana Radarange, Tappan RL1, or GE Countertop? Amana Radarange. Which designer created the iconic I Love New York logo in 1977? Saul Bass, Paul Rand, or Milton Glaser? Milton Glaser. What was the first commercially successful jet airliner introduced in 1952? The Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, or the de Havilland Comet? The de Havilland Comet. Which influential abstract artist was known for his color field paintings featuring rectangular blocks of color? Mark Rothko, Joseph Albers, or Barnett Newman? Mark Rothko. What was the first commercially successful tape recorder for home use, introduced in 1948? Ampex, Grundig, or Sound Mirror? Sound Mirror. Which influential fashion model was known as the Shrimp and helped define the 60s mod look? Twiggy, Jean Shrimpton, or Verushka? Jean Shrimpton. What was the first commercially successful compact disc player introduced in 1982? Sony, Philips, or Pioneer? Sony. Which pioneering filmmaker directed Seven Samurai in 1954? Yasuhiro Ozu, Federico Fellini, or Akira Kurosawa? Akira Kurosawa. What was the first commercially successful disposable diaper, introduced in 1961? Huggies, Loves, or Pampers? Pampers. Which influential blues musician was known as the King of the Delta Blues Singers? Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, or B.B. King? Robert Johnson. What was the first commercially successful home video game released in 1975? Computer Space, Pong, or Breakout? Pong. Which pioneering female physicist worked on the Manhattan Project and later became a vocal opponent of nuclear weapons? Marie Curie, Lisa Meitner, or Xian Wu? Xian Wu. What was the first commercially successful frozen TV dinner, introduced in 1954? Swanson, Stouffer's, or Morton? Swanson. Which influential blues guitarist was known as the father of Chicago blues and recorded Hoochie Coochie Man? Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, or B.B. King? Muddy Waters. What was the first commercially successful instant camera with integral film? Introduced in 1972. Polaroid square shooter, Kodak EK4, or the Polaroid? The Polaroid SX70. What was the first commercially successful fax machine for business use? Introduced in 1966. Xerox, Panasonic, or 3M faxograph? The Xerox telecopier. What was the first commercially successful cordless telephone for home use? Introduced in 1977. AT&T Nomad 1000, Sony SPP11, or the Amtel CT300? Amtel CT300. What was the first commercially successful compact camera with automatic exposure? Introduced in 1959. Kodak Instamatic, Olympus Pen, or Agfa Optimo? Agfa Optimo. Which influential fashion designer introduced the women's pantsuit as high fashion in the 60s? Mary Quant, Coco Chanel, or Yves Saint Laurent? Yves Saint Laurent. Which influential poet and playwright wrote A Raisin in the Sun, which premiered on Broadway in 1959? James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, or Lorraine Hansberry? Lorraine Hansberry. What was the first commercially successful household air conditioner? Introduced in 1951. Fetter's Roommate, Westinghouse Mobilair, or Carrier Room Weathermaker? Carrier Room Weathermaker. Which pioneering female scientist was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1964 for her work on molecular structures, including DNA? Marie Curie, Rosalind Franklin, or Dorothy Hodgkin? Dorothy Hodgkin. What was the first commercially successful antacid tablet introduced in 1930? Tums, Rolaids, or Maalox? Tums. Which influential civil rights leader delivered the I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington in 1963? Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., or John Lewis? Martin Luther King Jr. What was the first commercially successful household food processor introduced in 1973? KitchenAid, Cuisinart, or Moulinex? Cuisinart. Which pioneering female journalist was the first American woman to become a war correspondent during World War II? Martha Gellhorn, Margaret Bourke-White, or Claire Booth Luce? Martha Gellhorn. What was the first commercially successful disposable razor? Introduced in 1975. Chick Super 2, Gillette Good News, or Wilkinson Bonded? Gillette Good News. Which pioneering female chef and author published Mastering the Art of French Cooking in 1961? Alice Waters, Julia Child, or Fanny Farmer? Julia Child. What was the first commercially successful electric toaster with automatic pop-up introduced in 1926? Sunbeam T9, Toastmaster 1A1, or Waters Genter Toaster? Waters Genter Toaster. Which influential filmmaker directed The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberries in 1957? Ingmar Bergman, Akira Kurosawa, or Francois Truffaut? Ingmar Bergman. Which pioneering female physician was the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States in 1849? Elizabeth Blackwell, Rebecca Lee Krempler, or Mary Putnam Jacobi? Elizabeth Blackwell. Thanks for playing this quiz. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.